welcome Paul to another edition of Message from America. And there's obviously a lot happening over in the United States at the moment, and in particular, obviously, this Hurricane Irma. And just cross to you for the latest on what you see there, and also from the point of view of how the federal government has been responding to this major threat that's looming off the eastern coastline.
Well, thanks for having me, Selwyn. I guess the theme of this week is flirting with disaster. And I say that because, we had Hurricane Harvey last week, which is now in the middle of its recovery phase. It caused, they estimate, about $150 billion worth of damage. The federal government has offered $7.5 billion in disaster relief, but obviously that's a big gap between the total amount of damages that's going to have to be recouped somewhere. And now Irma, which is a far stronger storm than Hurricane Harvey was. Hurricane Harvey was a Category 3. That means that it had sustained winds of up to 140 miles an hour. This storm coming towards the Florida mainland has sustained winds at this very moment of 175 to 185 miles an hour, with gusts up to 225. That's for, put it in metrics, that's 300 kilometer an hour gusts.
Wow, that's just amazing, isn't it? And they talk about the storm surge, or that's the height, isn't it, of the sea level that'll get sucked up like a vacuum cleaner. What are you looking at there, and what kind of damage going into the mainland if these amazing kind of predictions come to pass?
Well, they're estimating anywhere between 10 and 30 feet worth of storm surge, depending on exactly how the storm hits. For example, if it hits very south in Florida, like right now, you don't want to be in Key West, an otherwise beautiful place to be. But that way, they will push the storm onto the west coast. And they estimate if that's the case, they may get 20 to 30 feet waves. If it comes right up the east coast, there'll be some blocking because of the Bahamas, which just sits 60 miles off of the eastern coast of Florida, and so they're estimating 10 to 20 feet. Now, this is very personal to me because my U.S. home is squarely in the path of this storm. And my neighbors are, I left there 2 weeks ago. My neighbors are telling me to expect catastrophic damage to the house. I mean, they're making no bones about it. They're like, if the winds come in at these speeds, even though the house is built out of cement cinder blocks, the windows could well go. There will be flooding because it will push that water up into the house. So I can't say that it's a good moment for the Buchanan clan, with regards to our home in Florida.
Because last time we spoke to you, you were actually at that place, weren't you? At your dwelling, basically, which you're describing now as right in the path of where Hurricane Irma is going to trek across. And of course, you're coming to us at the moment, speaking from Boston. Are you seeing any changes in the weather like you're seeing in Boston? Are you seeing the clouds above getting sucked south down to feed into this, or is it not quite showing there yet?
Yeah, not quite showing it yet, although the forecasts are that we'll get the tail end of this if it stays on its predicted path, and we'll get a lot of rain and some wind. Now, of course, if the storm turns to the east and stays off the coast of Florida, then we up here in Boston will be in a direct path. Although it should soften as it hits colder and colder water and diminish in strength, or at least that's what we're hoping. I think the important to think about, above and beyond my personal concerns about the family home, is that this is going to be a catastrophic event if it hits Florida. It will make Hurricane Andrew seem small, and Hurricane Andrew caused about $150 billion in damage in 1992. It dwarfs everything that's ever been seen before it. And the South Florida area, the Miami metropolitan area, to include Fort Lauderdale, Delray Beach, where my house is, has almost 7 million people living in it, which is double the size of the Houston area that was hit by Harvey. So this is a catastrophic event. I should also point out that it is hitting the territories, U.S. territories of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so when it comes to disaster relief and recovery, it will not just be the mainland that has to be attended to. And if you think in terms of foreign relations, Dominican Republic and Haiti are squarely in the path of this storm, as is Cuba. I doubt very much the United States would offer assistance to Cuba, but certainly it will be asked for assistance from the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And here's where, the rubber meets the road. Donald Trump is not very big on giving assistance and aid to foreign countries. In fact, he's been a little reluctant to give aid to states that didn't vote for him. And so the question here is, although he's managed to secure a relief package for both Harvey and Irma that amounts to $15 billion, so $7.5 billion in each place, that's going to be far from enough to handle the recovery efforts. And he had to cut the deal with the Democrats because the Republican majority in the House didn't want to do it by temporarily raising the debt ceiling. So this is how they're going to fund it, is they're going to raise the debt ceiling for 3 months, get the additional funding, and then in December revisit the theme again. It's basically kicking the can down the road. The Republican majority in the House did not want to do this. They wanted that funding to come from cuts elsewhere, education, other areas that Republicans have targeted. And even Trump's Treasury Secretary said, no, that cannot happen. We need to raise the debt ceiling to do this. Given that South Florida did not vote for Trump in last year's election, it was the only part of Florida that did not go for Trump, we shall see if, in fact, it gets the aid that it needs. And I only say that because Trump has a record of being vindictive.
Vindictive and spiteful in some of the ways.
It's not me. I'm not saying anything that isn't well known.
Another thing on that, Paul, is it seemed like that there was a reluctance by US President Trump to actually embrace the ideas and the arguments around climate change. Is there an acceptance, perhaps, that with Harvey only just having gone off and weakened off, with Hurricane Irma looming down on the United States, the biggest storm system that's ever been in the Atlantic since recordings began, and that there is a couple of other big heavy storms that are looming out there at the same time. Are people accepting that this may be the consequences of climate change? And if so, what impact does that have on President Trump's position on it, not just in the United States, but globally?
Well, that's a very good point, because the skeptics now have to confront the reality that the storms appear to be coming more frequently and are much stronger in intensity. So if President Trump continues to think that this is a Chinese hoax, he'll be disabused of that pretty soon, because, as you just said, there's another storm in the Atlantic, Hurricane Jose, that right now is a Category 2. It's about 500 miles behind Irma, and God forbid that storm also take aim at the U.S. eastern seaboard. But it's more than just these tropical storms. In the west of the United States, there's another disaster unfolding. There are wildfires in 6 different western states. There are over 100 of them, and they have burnt hundreds of thousands of acres of wildland, including the destruction of property and the loss of about a handful of lives so far. Many of these fires have not been contained. And here again, we have the problem with budgetary cutbacks in the federal government to include the Park Service, as well as the Federal Emergency Management Service. They simply may not be able to sustain the firefighting efforts that are going in. We've been focused on the hurricanes, but if you live in the west of the United States, these are devastating fires. In fact, one of them burnt into the Burbank Hills right outside of Los Angeles, destroying property. So we've got 3 calamities going. Harvey is now finished. Irma is about to hit. And the ongoing calamity that are these wildfires in the West, there simply is not enough money in the federal budget to either fight them in the case of the fires or to provide the type of recovery relief that is needed in the aftermath of these storms. So I would argue that if the president is open-minded enough, and he didn't just talk negatively about climate change and voice skepticism for political reasons, this will certainly disabuse him of the notion that climate change is a scientific fiction.
One of the other things that is coming through from what I can see from this end of the world, Paul, is that the impact that Hurricane Harvey had on Houston in particular wasn't just that it was a huge storm system, obviously a powerful storm system, but it was that the infrastructure hadn't been put in place to provide the adaptation to such storms tracking through that part of the United States. And that basically was one of the issues that was holding the water in that particular region and around Houston. Are you hearing much of that? Because that's what we're kind of hearing outside of the United States news cycles.
Well, the situation between southeastern Texas and Florida is quite different. Florida does have the advantage of having experienced Hurricane Andrew. Again, Hurricane Andrew in 1992 came in as a Category 4 right below Miami and wiped out everything in its path. It was mostly a windstorm. There wasn't as much water associated with it, and the surge was much less than the surge coming with Irma. But the important point is that after that storm, Florida tightened up all of its storm regulations. Every building built since then has to have reinforced doors, hurricane windows, that sort of thing. Now, my home is much older, so we were grandfathered in the older designs. I happen to be lucky that the architect who designed my home decided to go with cement cinder block rather than a wood frame. But nevertheless, Florida is much better prepared than southeast Texas to take on this storm, but there reaches a point where no amount of preparation is going to defend structures and infrastructure from punishing winds like the ones that we're seeing with Irma. I mean, once you get to 180, 185 miles an hour, structures, even hardened structures, begin to fall. And that's what the governor of Florida has been saying now. He's basically telling people, all those high rises that you see in Miami Beach, he's telling them to get out.
Yeah, we heard that. Get out, save your life. You can always rebuild your...
Mandatory evacuations are in place all up and down the eastern seaboard between the Atlantic Ocean and what is known as the intercoastal. The intercoastal is a series of canals that range from Miami all the way up to the New York area. They were built in World War II to avoid German submarines in the movement of goods and services. But what that does mean is that in Florida, particularly in South Florida, you have a peninsula, if you will, that's no more than 1.5 miles across. Everybody between the intercoastal and the ocean have been ordered to evacuate in 3 different counties, including where my home is located. We'll have to see if people do in fact heed the warnings, but I certainly know that if I was still there, I would. And so the idea is, even if you're well prepared in a measure that the Houston area was not, there's very little you can do at this point if this storm stays as strong as it is.
Okay, if we go back to, in conclusion on this particular topic, look at President Trump. Does he see this as an opportunity to redefine his presidency, meaning these disasters that are looming down on the United States from natural causes?
Yes, he does. And in fact, he's had a pretty good week for him, because he returned to the Houston area for the second time after being criticized for the first visit, which got nowhere near the affected areas, in which he didn't talk to anyone who was directly affected. He talked to some recovery workers, some rescue workers, but he was away from the fray. The second time, he handed out relief packages, he cuddled babies who had been displaced. He did the things, even if they're PR, that people expect presidents to do. Then he returned to Washington, and he was able to announce that he was going to push through some legislation repealing the so-called Dreamers Act, which basically gave a type of amnesty to children who had been brought to the States by their parents who were undocumented workers and who are not citizens. And basically the amnesty was, if you don't have a criminal record, you've been lived in the States, you have no connection to your parents' country, after a couple of years you can apply for preferred citizenship. Well, he was able to come back from Houston and basically tell Congress, I'm getting rid of that act. And the Republicans in Congress said, fine, they have the majority, we will do, in fact, repeal that act and perhaps not replace it at all. So he scored a political victory right after that. Now, given the Republican resistance to raising the debt ceiling, he scored another victory, although this may be a Faustian bargain. When the Republicans refused to raise the debt ceiling, he turned to the Democrats and he cut a deal with them. So he's now moved in a bipartisan fashion. Now, I cannot fathom why the Democrats would want to cut a deal with him, but they have always been interested in disaster relief. I mean, they don't have the sort of lack of empathy, for a lack of a better phrase, that the Republicans have exhibited. You may remember that when Hurricane Sandy came through the eastern seaboard two or 3 years ago, Senators Ted Cruz and John Croiner from Texas refused to provide to approve additional federal funds for disaster relief in those areas. The Republicans tend to get very parochial when it comes to discretionary funding. And so Trump went to the Democrats, knowing that they would agree with him. And he is now saying, very much to the consternation of the Republican leadership in the House, that if the Republican majority in the House doesn't want to cooperate with him, he'll go to the Democrats when he needs to, and he'll secure the majorities he needs with them. And so that has caused fallout in the Republican Party. If it wasn't fractured before, this is driving a wedge between the Tea Party types and the more moderate factions. He's ruining them. I mean, he's destroying the lower house support for his presidency, but he's gaining Democratic support both in the House and the Senate in doing so. So he's actually achieved some victories as a result of these natural disasters. But again, depending on how the recovery goes, depending about whether the loss of life and the wildfires, as well as these tropical storms, does not, go to very large numbers, he can ride high on this. But again, it's 3 months worth of funding. Come December, the arguments are going to start again. So he's had a good moment, but there's a lot of other water to cross, to pardon the pun, before he can consider his presidency to be successful.
Now, if we look off coast, look out further over to Asia Pacific and across to North Korea, we've obviously got some major challenges for US President Donald Trump in how he handles, specifically he as an individual handles this increased concerns relating to North Korea's nuclear weaponry there. And of course what we're alluding to there is the revelations that North Korea certainly does indeed have a hydrogen bomb or a thermonuclear weapon that it perhaps can actually carry on the nose cones of a intercontinental ballistic missile. So how do you believe Trump, one, has been handling this, and also his administration, and secondly, what's going to be happening next in this whole standoff and crisis on the North Korean or the Korean Peninsula?
Well, the options are very limited. And again, this is why this has been the week about flirting with disaster, because where those other disasters were natural, this one is man-made. And the North Koreans have now demonstrated that they have made a quantum leap in terms of their ability to weaponize their nuclear program. Thermonuclear bombs are not, they're much more complicated than simple atomic bombs. And as a result, to be able to show that they can detonate these things means they're way more advanced than anyone suspected they were. Of course, we know that they can fire intercontinental ballistic missiles. They've already tested that in the last few months. So the question is, how much longer will it be before they can put one of these hydrogen warheads on the top of one of those missiles? That's not a good situation, and unfortunately, the United States has very little options, diplomatic or economic for that matter, short of military recourse. Now, The president has said the time for talking is over. Needless to say, that was a mistake. That statement's been walked back by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the State Department. But right now, the United States is looking to China to pressure North Korea to back off. Now, the Chinese are not going to engage in any further sanctions. You know, they have their own geopolitical reasons for propping up the North Koreans. But let's remember, patron-client relationships in international relations are, there's not a subservient relationship. Many times the tail wags the dog. And in this case, North Korea is definitely doing the wagging. So the Chinese, although embarrassed because they had asked the North Koreans to not go through with this test, are not going to abandon them anytime soon. And the Russians have said that they reject completely the notion that increased sanctions should be leveled.
This was on the back. This was on the back of the BRICS meeting, wasn't it?
Exactly, but also the Russian opposition means that nothing's going to happen in the Security Council at the UN, because any resolution to impose harsher sanctions will be vetoed by the Russians and/or the Chinese.
Well, this raises a question, Paul, just on that point. Of course, I'm located way down in the South Pacific in New Zealand at the moment, and there's an election on. And one of the differences of opinion here, perhaps, that is coming through from the two main parties that are running, that will dominate office after September 23rd, is the rising Labour Party leader, Jacinda Ardern, is adamant that with respect to North Korea and with respect to the United States' responses to this, that New Zealand ought to seek and maintain its relationship with a UN mandate, meaning a multilateral endorsed response to North Korea, and stay out of commitments or forward commitments with respect to the United States, Australia, and North Korea. What do you make of that compared to the other counterbalance to that, the other party, the National Party, that has been in government here for almost 9 years? And it says, no, we are there as partners. We have a thing called the Washington Declaration. While it is not an alliance that forward commits us, we are very much in with the Australians and the United States responses to the North Korean crisis. So how do you see the merits of both of those arguments from a New Zealand point of view, of a small independent Pacific Island state that is looking at whether or not it should engage on something at this juncture?
Well, I think that the need for diplomacy is paramount, and New Zealand shouldn't blindly follow its military partners into conflicts of their own making. And the reason I say that is that there is some room for negotiation between the North Koreans and the United States and several other interlocutors, the South Koreans and the Chinese, among others. The problem here is that, on the one hand, there seems to be this sense that the only negotiations that can occur between Trump and Kim Jong-un. And that's simply not feasible. Lower level negotiations with experts represented on both sides is the far better way to go to, if nothing else, prepare an agenda for the leaders to then sit down and have a discussion. Now, the North Koreans have all along wanted to be recognized as the legitimate government of the North. You see, since the armistice, the United States has called for two things: regime change in North Korea and reunification of North and South Korea under the government of the Republic of Korea.
And is that a wise position to actually adopt?
I don't think so. I think the parallel I would use is Israel. For all the talk about from certain Arab quarters that Israel needs to be removed from the face of the earth, the hard fact of the matter is Israel's going nowhere. It's here to stay. The same applies for North Korea. You can wish it away, you can deny its legitimacy, but it's not going anywhere. It has a major patron on its northern borders. I mean, it's here to stay. And so recognizing that as a preliminary qualifier to sitting down to negotiate some trade-offs with regards to the nuclear weapons program seems to me to be a reasonable thing to do. Now, the North Koreans are going to push hard. See, they think they have the advantage right now because what they've seen is that Trump is all about bluster and bullying. And if they call his bluff, as they did a few weeks ago, he seems to back down. So they want a removal of all U.S. forces from South Korea. Well, that's not going to happen. They want a removal of all U.S. maritime assets from the East China Sea. That's not going to happen. But they do want recognition of their regime as the legitimate government of the North. That could happen. That's something, that's a concession that the United States can give, again, even as a precondition to more serious talks about nuclear weapons. Now, my understanding from scholars of North Korea, they are pretty unanimous in saying these guys will never give up their nuclear weapons. That remains to be seen. Again, it's not just the United States who's worried about them. The Chinese, for example, are increasingly worried about the radioactive fallout from this nuclear test program. Apparently, they're starting to see radioactive increases on their border near the testing sites.
Well, that's a whole new incentive for China to actually do something about that. Perhaps pull in five-nation talk type of ideas again, like we saw back in the 2000s. That would be an interesting kind of development if that's pushed even stronger. We're not hearing down in Australia and New Zealand, we're not hearing a lot about that particular angle. So that's obviously one that the Chinese could play.
Well, and also, I think that that's a role that New Zealand could play. You see, the five-party talks were useful in delaying the North Korean nuclear program at that time. And in fact, Winston Peters was the foreign minister at the time and was able to broker a deal by which Japanese bunker oil was sent to North Korea in exchange for their dismantling of some of their missile sites, their missile testing sites. So those were concrete things that were accomplished through the five-party talks. And if I was an advisor to the Labor Party, given the tone of its leaders' comments about this issue, I would start talking about resuming the five-party talks in order to see if a replication of the successes of 10 years ago could be accomplished now.
Yeah, because I remember at the time it was very specific. I was up in Seoul at the time reporting, and the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, at that time was up there too. And there was a significant meeting. This is immediately prior to the five-nation talks developing. And there was a meeting that was called between Helen Clark, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and Henry Kissinger, who obviously had no official role to play there, but was seen as an envoy of the then US President George W. Bush. And it was on the basis of that and meetings that the New Zealand Prime Minister had later with the Chinese and with the South Koreans that started the ideas of getting that five-nation talks going together. So sometimes, I pick up your point, that sometimes a small independent country with perhaps high ideals and currency in the anti-nuclear movement can have some sort of brokerage role at getting things started. An interesting time here from the point of view that if it looks like at this stage the Labour Party will be in the box seat to form an election here, and it will be hungry to get a defining difference between where it has been on foreign policy and particularly where its predecessor, if that comes to pass, the National Party has been in the last 9 years. But this is obviously a small part of the Pacific, but certainly the ratcheting up of the security concerns relating to North Korea, it puts a doubt perhaps in some people's minds that deterrence actually works from the point of view of when you've got what could be labelled a rogue state that seems undeterred from the point of view of fear of actually being blasted off the face of the earth should it actually fire one of these things. And I just wonder whether or not this angle that you've raised here is one of the soundest ways of getting the engagement going, where there's a pull back from that red line, if you like.
Well, the key is to ensure the North Korean regime's survival. Maybe unpleasant to say so. They're obviously an authoritarian and quite unpleasant regime. They've done no great favors to their own people, but as I said before, they're here to stay. They need to be recognized. Now, New Zealand has a bit of a predicament because although it's very well known for its its commitment to non-proliferation, it has signed these military agreements with the United States.
The Washington Declaration, for example.
Washington and the Wellington Declarations.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say is there's enough wiggle room in those declarations for New Zealand to say to the United States, if you start a conflict with North Korea before they launch a nuclear weapon anywhere, then we're not going to go and carry the can with you.
Yeah, I think on that point, back here, the mood appears to be that the Washington Declaration in particular, that frames the defence relationship with New Zealand and the United States, was done in an environment where Hillary Clinton was one of the main brokers, and certainly the Obama administration was well entrenched. A lot of the principles there are on the basis of that administration's foreign policy. And it seems a long bow to draw if you are going to expect some of what the United States may consider friends and allies at the moment to say that they're willing to go into a Donald Trump-led war. If the diplomacy opportunities are not taken up, are not exhausted before that more catastrophic option is deployed, I don't see that there's going to be an appetite in these countries outside of the United States, Australia aside, to actually get involved, considering the President's positions and his responses that are more inflammatory and retaliatory. But that's the mood, I would say, and underline outside of here. Is that something that the United States citizenry would be picking up, considering the position that is developing on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think right now the assumption is that everybody views the situation with North Korea the way the United States does. And even though Trump is an extreme example of the sort of bullying approach to the North Koreans, most Americans, both scholars as well as lay people, seem to believe, well, the North Koreans are simply in the wrong, they're acting insane, we need to deal with them. The trouble with that is that doesn't capture the reality of the complexities of the North Korean regime. Again, we need people who speak Korean, who understand, these complexities, in order to be able to craft some sort of response to them. And I haven't really seen, of course, this is through the mass media and whatnot, anything even closely resembling a sophisticated analysis of how to do something in a non-military way that may assuage the North Koreans' fears that the United States is going to attack them. And here's the rub for us. Obviously enough, if the North Koreans launch a nuclear-tipped missile at anybody, then the international community will coalesce around the United States in its military response to them. That's simply unacceptable behavior. And New Zealand will certainly join
a multilateral response
against them.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. The best military strategy for the United States, if it sees that the North Koreans are in fact going to put a live missile into a tube and try to fire
is preemptive.
Is to preempt them.
Yeah.
If they preempt them, they'll do so conventionally. They are not going to break the nuclear threshold. They have conventional munitions that can target the missile launcher sites. But the United States will start that war. And the question for policymakers in New Zealand is, if the Americans started, do we necessarily follow? One can make the argument, look, they had no choice. They had to preempt because the North Koreans were in fact going to fire a nuclear missile. But the fact is that means the United States made the initial military move. As a result of that, there will be a war. There will be a war that involves the South Koreans at a minimum, could well involve the Japanese, and by simple alliance commitments, it may involve the Chinese. And so it's a can of worms that New Zealand may find itself drawn into, because the waters are much more muddied with a preemptive attack as opposed to a reactive defense once a missile has been fired. All of which is to say, there's got to be room for negotiation. We can't let it come to this. And if it means that New Zealand stands up as an honest broker in international affairs, because it is small, because it is independent, then I would say by all means, please do that. Be a voice of reason. And I can guarantee you that if New Zealand or other small states, let's say Singapore, raise the idea of sitting down in something that's more or less akin to the five-party talks, it will receive a lot of support. Because right now we're headed towards a military confrontation that in the end will be winnable on the part of the United States, but quite frankly, in terms of the loss of lives and destruction that will result from a relatively short war, there will be no winners over the long term.
Okay, well on that point, Paul, I'll leave it and look forward to the next bulletin of the message from America that you and I do. And let's hope it doesn't get to that particular scenario that we all fear.
I sure hope not, and I look forward to talking again.